Hello everyone. I want to welcome each and every one of you to our really important and interesting course on osteopenia. Osteopenia, 9 things your doctor never told you. 9 facts your doctor never told you because your doctor didn't know these facts. I'm going to teach you the real deeper perspective, the real inside story on osteopenia, how the term developed to take on the use it has today, and how it has been misused actually and misinterpreted. We're going to move hopefully from being scared of the word osteopenia to totally understanding what it means, where it came from, and what implication it may have for you and your bone health. So sit back, enjoy this. Here goes our deep dive into osteopenia. The first thing I want to remind you and tell you about osteopenia is that osteopenia is not a disease, nor a disorder, nor a diagnosis. And it was never meant to be that. When you look at the major osteoporosis researchers who were involved in the early days when this term was developed, they always said it was not meant for this. And I'm going to explain to you what it was meant for in just a few minutes. Osteopenia today, as we use it, has no medical meaning. No medical meaning at all. It merely just describes a status of bone density. And again, we're going to get into that in just a second, exactly what it describes. Osteopenia, however, the term osteopenia did have a medical meaning, and that was several decades ago. And that medical meaning relates to the term osteo, which is bone, and penia, which means a lack of or a reduction. So for all of history, osteopenia simply meant a reduction in bone mass. And it's very similar to leukopenia. Leukocytes are white blood cells. Leukopenia is a reduction in white blood cells. There's many other medical terms like this. For example, sarcopenia is a reduction in muscle. Again, you'll find it in erythropenia. Red blood cells are called erythrocytes. A lack of red blood cells or a reduction in red blood cells is called erythropenia. And finally, lymphopenia is a reduction of lymphocytes or white blood cells. So you'll notice in all of these definitions, there's the concept there's a reduction of a simple factor. To know the reduction, you have to know what the average is. So we're indicating that this indicates, whether it's white blood cells or muscle mass, or whether it's bone, something lower than the average. The ability to talk about osteopenia came with this measurement of bone density testing. Actually, the new term of osteopenia, the way we use osteopenia today, when people say, I have osteopenia, what it reflects is what they did after the bone density testing. The interesting thing here, when I started working with bone health, it was about in 1984. And I went to a conference at Harvard University where the major researchers, the men who were developing these bone density machines, were there. They were talking about their machines, and it was really a fascinating time because they were totally convinced. They said, now we can measure bone density, so we are going to be able to predict who will fracture. It's really simple. What we do is we measure lots and lots of people with bone density. We get the bone densities. We figure out what the average bone density is for any age group, say one for women 30 and one for women 50. And then we can set up segments, and we say the people with the very lowest bone density, we're going to call them, we're going to give the diagnosis of osteoporosis to them. And the people who have a bone mass, a bone density that measures better than the average young person, we're going to call them normal. And someplace in between there, between somewhat less than average but not as much as osteoporosis, we're going to call that osteopenia, a reduction in bone mass. And what's happened over time is that definition has taken on the feeling of a diagnosis when it really wasn't meant to, and it really is not a diagnosis. What's interesting about this that you're going to see, and what was fascinating to be there in 1984, is that they were convinced if they could measure bone density, they could tell who was going to fracture. But you know what's happened? We found out that that's not true. You cannot predict fracture by bone density. And that's one of the important things I'm going to talk to you about today. So in 1992, there was new use, a new invention, a new fabrication of the word osteopenia and what it should mean. Small group of researchers. People often comment that these researchers were all men, and they were largely funded by the pharmaceutical industry, who got together and said, we have a lot of bone density test measurements done now, so let's start classifying people. If you have a certain measurement, let's call you osteoporosis. Another measurement, let's call you osteopenia. And over time, that osteopenia came on to have the tenor of pre-osteoporosis, but it really need not be so. So here's how it was. Before the mid-1980s, osteopenia was just defined by reduced bone mass. You got to the mid-80s, when I went to this Harvard meeting, they started gathering all these bone density tests. And they said, we can figure out what the average bone density is for any age group we want. By 1992, they had enough data that they got together and said, hey, let's define these, let's make up some disorders and define them by bone density. So they decided osteoporosis would be minus 2.5 standard deviations or more. And I'm going to take a second to remind you about standard deviations because you might have forgotten your high school math or your statistics. And it's important because it's kind of empowering to know how this is. And if you have a little bit better bone density than that, we're going to call it but not quite normal. We're going to call it osteopenia, between -1 and -2.5 standard deviations away from the average young woman. Now you remember the T-score really compares you to the average 30-year-old of the same sex. And of course the people that are better than average or very close to average, they were called normal. So here's how it looks. 1992, osteopenia no longer just meant reduced bone mass, but it began to talk about a particular bone density. And over time, that was unfortunately misinterpreted to indicate a disease or a disorder. In fact, over time, millions of people, in fact, 44 million people in this country, that's almost half of all the adults, are now classified as having osteopenia. It became to be seen as a diagnosis. It became to seen as a medical term. Although if you look at the major researchers, like a few we're going to cite here, they tell you even today it was never meant for that, and that's not the proper use of the term osteopenia. With this new slipping into osteopenia being a diagnosis, we came upon what I call the great osteopenia scare. Every day I see women who come to me saying, I've been told I have osteopenia. It's even suggested I shouldn't continue with my sports. I shouldn't ski. Just the other day, a woman, strong woman, she had a really strong handshake. She was strong. She said, I got so scared. They told me I had osteopenia, so my cousin called me to go skating. I said, I can't go skating. I might fracture and fall. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people who are scared by this diagnosis, not realizing that it could be a perfectly normal bone density for them. So this is Stephen Cummings, a major researcher, way involved with all of osteoporosis for a long time. He expresses the same situation. I have seen patients who come in scared they will become disabled soon because they have this disease called osteopenia, when in fact they're normal for their age. So right away we notice the authorities also agree osteopenia was not and is not a diagnosis, and it may be perfectly normal, or as you're going to see in this class, it may indicate for certain small number of individuals that they are indeed at greater risk of fracture at some time in the future. Robert Neer, another big researcher, he also was led to comment that the problem if we have this calling osteopenia a disease when it is not, what Dr. Neer suggests that we're overtreating a large number of healthy women, like those 44 million, or the vast majority of them that have been told they have osteopenia. We're treating these people needlessly at a very high expense and at the risk of serious side effects, while ignoring the number of people at really high risk. Those would be the people that we're going to try to help you distinguish, even amongst the osteopenia group, who's at high risk and who's really not. So just to summarize again, osteopenia simply means that your bone density is lower than that of the average 30-year-old. Now, if I'm 60 or 70, my bone density, my muscle, my everything is going to be somewhat different than a 30-year-old. So it's not unusual. It does not necessarily imply any greater risk. For example, just to summarize, if you look at the U.S., you're going to see that when they started doing these studies and they were able to measure millions of people in bone density, they found out that if you put together the 9 or 10 million people with osteoporosis and the 44 million people with osteopenia, that's half of the population over 50. The other half has normal bone density. So don't be frightened. You're in good company if your doctor says, hey, your bone density says osteopenia, because half of the adults will have that very same situation. The question is, when is that a particularly pressing situation for you? And even more, as I'm going to talk, to me, the real benefit of studying bone health and looking at osteopenia is that it's just another opportunity to bring our attention to the importance of caring for our health. And bone health, a concern with bone health, is a great window of opportunity to enter the world of greater self-care. Not that we worry specifically about bone, but that we do a strong bone building program like the Better Bones, Better Body program, which is good for all of you. So as you focus on your bone, you're taking care of all of your health. So half of the women a large part of the population will be said they have osteopenia. It's certainly not just a female issue. The total, just to review, the total American population above 50 is about 108 million. Of this, 44 million will be said to have an osteopenic bone density, 44%. About 10 million will have osteoporosis, that's 9%. And 45 million will have normal bone density. So the way they're measuring this bone density, it's split right down the middle. The important thing to keep in mind is there's a big body of people with osteopenia. And so we're going to see some interesting facts about who fractures and which of these groups fracture. And we're going to see all of these groups fracture, but some more than others. So we have 2 million fractures per year. And the interesting thing about this, as calculated by the National Osteoporosis Foundation, is that they say that 1 in 2 women will experience some sort of osteoporotic low trauma fracture during their lifetime, as will 1 in 4 men. Perhaps some of these fractures are hidden spinal fractures people don't know about. Even if these statistics are somewhat exaggerated by the National Osteoporosis Foundation, it still indicates a very important fact that many people fracture. We here at the Center for Better Bones know there's a lot you can do yourself to prevent from ever having a fracture, and also enhancing your total body well-being. So let's just take a minute and look at this definition of osteopenia by standard deviations from the mean. This is a standard deviation curve. This is the mean. So if we're talking about bone density, this would be the average bone density. You have certain people that are very near the average. They're within 1 standard deviation. And then you have people that get further away, that they're more than 1 standard deviation away from the average. When it came to bone health, here's what they said. They said the people right around average, within 1 standard deviation, whether they're 1 standard deviation higher bone density or 1 standard deviation lower, we're going to call those normal bone density. And when you get to 1 standard deviation and more, actually 1 standard deviation to minus 2.5 standard deviations, we're going to call those osteopenia. Just because they were thinking they have to classify those somehow, they were really aiming at defining osteoporosis, that small number of people who had a bone density that was minus 2.5 standard deviations to lower. So the tail end of the low bone densities. And actually, as I mentioned before, they really believed that if they could identify these people, they would know who was going to fracture. And that's really an interesting story where many times we see medicine doesn't turn out like we predict it will. And we have 30, 40 years, we look back, we say, we made a little bit of a mistake. So, as it is, there's 44 million in the people in the country described as having osteopenia. 10 million have osteoporosis as measured by bone mineral density, and that's 1/2 of all adults. So you're in good company if you've been told you have osteopenia. As we talk about osteopenia, I want you to keep one thing in mind. Bone density is directly influenced by body weight and body size. I bet that many of you listening to this talk are going to be either small bone people or thin people. Why? Because you have become frightened about osteopenia because you've been told you have osteopenia, but it's largely related to your body size. And in fact, there's a direct relationship, a direct linear relationship between body weight and bone density. In fact, this data I collected from a colleague of mine, Gilbert Katz, who does bone density testing for companies and research projects. He had 10,000 subjects. I asked him to run this data for me, and you can see it's a clear relationship. The lower your body weight, the lower your bone density is going to be. And so it's another reason that thin people should take this whole diagnosis with a grain of salt. As we go on in the different courses, I'm going to teach you that thin people do have, in some ways, a greater risk of fracture, particularly hip fracture. There apparently it seems to be twice the hip fracture rate amongst thin people. So you want to pay attention, but it's not a cause to be worried that your bone density is low if you're thin or small bone, because the bones only, they go together with the whole body. A small body is going to have small bones. Now, it is important to know that these bone density machines, just as an aside, these bone density machines really don't measure density totally because they're greatly influenced by area. So people with smaller bones are also going to come out with lower measurements just because of the way the bone density tests are done. In a little bit, I'm going to tell you what to look for if you're thin, what you want to pay attention to, like you don't want to keep losing bone at an accelerated rate. But it's worthy to step back, take a deep breath, and say, yeah, my bone density is lower than the average 30-year-old, but also I may be older and I'm thinner than the average. I'm lighter than the average 30-year-old. I have smaller bones. So, the fourth point is that fracture cannot be predicted by bone density. And this is where I want you to be comfortable with this fact. Bone density can be one risk factor, but you cannot predict fracture by bone density. In fact, after they started doing all these bone density tests, and now 30 years later, 40 years later, they're looking back, what they see, many studies showing that you can't predict fracture by bone density. As a matter of fact, the US, there was a very large NORA osteoporosis study, and what they found was that 82% of the postmenopausal women who experienced a fracture during this large study didn't have an osteoporosis bone density. In other words, they weren't in that minus 2.5 and worse standard deviations away from the normal. So you start thinking, 82%, that's a lot. In essence, what these people had, their T-scores were minus 2.49 or better. They had either osteopenia, as you would call it, or normal bone density, yet they still fractured. In another large survey of osteoporotic fractures, they found that only 10 to 44% of osteoporotic fractures, and by we mean osteoporotic fracture, a fracture that occurs with low trauma, like typically a fall from standing position. If you fracture, that's considered an osteoporotic fracture. Only anywhere from 10 to 44% of all these low trauma fractures occurred in people with osteoporotic bone densities. So as you see, most fractures occur in people who don't have extremely low bone density. What does it remind us of? It reminds us of there's something else that's important, many other things that are important to making bone strong and resistant to fractures than just bone density. And in fact, in some European studies, they've looked at different areas of different European countries, and several studies show that you can have similar bone densities with different fracture rates according to the different populations. And certainly, they found that the same bone mass in Northern Europe is associated with a substantially higher fracture risk than that of Southern Europe. Say Sweden is compared to Italy. There's something more than bone density to determine fracture risk. What I want to point out at this particular juncture is that anyone can fracture, and everyone should care. Everyone should take advantage to build bone strength. Many, many fractures occur with normal bone density, and I was very surprised because this data is hard to find. But recently I was looking at a piece of research that looked at 4,500 fracture patients, and they found that up to a third of those fracture patients had either normal or slightly below normal bone mineral density. So it's pretty clear you cannot predict fracture by bone density, and it's also clear that many people can experience fragility fractures, osteoporotic fractures, not just those with a low bone density. So the question pops up, if bone density doesn't predict fracture, what predicts fracture better? How can we predict fracture? Think about it. I wish we were interactive so you could pop up your answer to me, because I bet some of you are thinking of the right answer. And the right answer, of course, is that it's multiple risk factors. It's probably not one factor. In a few cases, it may be one factor, but like you might be taking a very strong drug that damages bone, or you might have a disease that damages bone, but mostly your fracture risk is determined by your total load of multiple risk factors. This is my favorite little camel illustration. It sort of depicts dietary and lifestyle changes. There are other ways of assessing risk. For example, this Dr. Cummings I mentioned, this famous researcher, Stephen Cummings, as early as 1995, he sat down and said, well, let me see who really is fracturing hips. So he looked at an older population. Say, do you know what the average age of hip fracture is in this country? Yeah, it's about 80 or maybe even 81. So he looked at people who fractured, and you got to know these are probably going to be mostly people in their 80s or so. And he found that hip fracture risk was 17 times greater amongst the 15% of the women who had 5 or more risk factors. So multiple risk factors is what was associated with the risk of fracturing a hip. Now, interestingly, he did not include bone density in this analysis. They didn't have bone density tests. They just looked at people who fractured and their risk factors. So you had 17 times more fracture in the small number of women who had many risk factors, as opposed to this 47% of the women who had just 2 or fewer risk factors. And this was without the bone density. Very striking support of this multiple risk factor theory. If you might say, well, gee, what were these risk factors? Now keep in mind that these were older people, but one of them was age. I'm going to show you that age is important. One of them was a history of maternal hip fractures, and I think we know now that if your mother or father fractured, that puts you at higher risk. One was the height at age 25. It's peculiar. In those old days, they started looking at height and said, gee, the taller people sometimes may fracture more. Then low self-rated health. And what we've always argued, of course, is that bone health is just related to the total body health. And if you have total body health, you're going to have better bone health. The people that said, I don't feel so good, I'm ill, they were more likely to fracture. Previous hyperthyroidism, problems of the thyroid, of parathyroid, when they get overactive, they can really damage bone. Current use of long-acting benzodiazepines. You know what those benzodiazepines are? Those are those mood-altering drugs that we used to give seniors. Hopefully we don't give them so much, because as you become sedated, you tend to fall. And certainly, we'd remind everyone that falling is a major risk for fracture. So anything that causes you to fall, stay away from it. Current use of anticonvulsant drug, these drugs for seizures are very damaging to bone. A high caffeine intake. He found that the seniors who took higher caffeine, maybe more than 2 or 3 cups of coffee a day, they had greater fracture risk. People who didn't stand on their feet they were less than 4 hours a day on their feet. And we've talked a lot about how it's so important to be able to be up and active. You know, if you put a person in bed for a couple months, they'll lose 30% of their bone density. But if you just stand them up, even if you stand them up against a wall and they have that force of gravity, it'll limit the bone loss. We need to be on our feet. Seniors who are on their feet less than 4 hours a day fractured more. Some simple tests like the inability to rise from a chair, how quickly you can get up from a chair without using your arms. Hopefully all of you can do that just well, but as we get older, sometimes it's a challenge. And this thing of vision, like if you can't see depth perception really well, if you can't visualize that, that's a risk for fracture. And this being able to contrast the distance between things. One of the final ones was a pulse rate that was higher than 80. A higher pulse also is an indication of a stress response. Kind of fun to measure your own pulse. We like to have a pulse maybe 60, maybe 70, but a nice relaxed pulse is good. And then, of course, an important factor is any fracture since the age of 50. And I would say any fragility fracture, any fracture that occurs with low trauma, that is really a sign, it's really a very serious risk factor for a future fracture. Okie doke. And then in this case, they did look at heel bone density at one point in the study. And even though his data was independent of bone density, he did find that lower heel density was also one of the factors that contributed to the chance that you would fracture a hip. Now, there's many ways to assess the likelihood of fracture, the risk of fracture. We at the betterbones.com website, we have our own risk factor quiz. You might look at that. It's kind of fun to look at the common factors that add up to this total load of factors that can make one vulnerable to fracture. If you're in osteopenia, you want to say, one thing is to have a bone density that's different from a young person, but another thing is to have many risk factors on top of that. As a matter of fact, it's kind of interesting. The Canadians looked at these risk factors and these secondary causes, what they call secondary causes, things that tend to cause osteopenia, whether it's a drug, medications, whether it's a lifestyle factor, whether it's a genetic disorder. They say that there's 125 secondary causes for osteoporosis. So there's a lot of them, but you can start assessing the most common ones on betterbones.com or another risk factor assessment form. Number 5, being told that you have osteopenia does not necessarily mean you will fracture. And I hope you got that idea from what we've been saying before. It is not an indication that you're going to have to fracture. And this leads us to the great osteoporosis paradox. And this paradox is you can't predict fracture by bone density. I've just showed you that. Being told you have osteopenia, that is, you have a bone density that's lower than a young person, does not mean you will fracture. But the majority of low trauma fractures, what we would call osteoporotic fractures, occur in people with osteopenia or even with normal bone density. There's so many people with osteopenia, 44 million, and so many people with normal bone density that fracture, that they add up to be more fractures in those groups than there is in the osteoporosis group. So defining by bone density, you can see that people with even a normal bone density or an osteopenic bone density really can fracture, and the majority of fractures occur within there. So this is kind of a paradox. On the one hand, I'm telling you, bone density cannot predict fracture, and that multiple risk factors predict fracture. To prove this, we see many people fracturing with bone density, which we'd say is fairly good and not in the low range, not in the excessively low range at all. So it's a big paradox. The paradox is we want to take action, we want to be attent, but we don't want to be overly worried about it. We want to think carefully about it, take decisive action, but not just say, oh, I have osteopenia, it means I'm going to fracture, or I have osteopenia and I don't have to pay any attention to it because I'm a thin person and that's just the size of my bone when I'm healthy. So this brings us to another interesting topic, and this is really one of the innovations that we're working on here at the Center for Better Bones, and this is that there are different types of osteopenia. In other words, we've taken 44 million people and said, oh, these all have osteopenia, it's all the same. But really, there are many different types. And we're working on categorizing these types right now so you yourself can figure out how much having osteopenia contributes to your risk of fracture at some point in the future. What we can say is that some of these types of osteopenia are more concerning than others. For example, we were doing some calculations, and about 1 in 30 people with an osteopenic bone density will experience a low trauma fracture every year. There's about 1.5, 2 million low trauma fractures a year, and about 1 in 30 people with osteopenia will fracture. It's not a big number, but still, it's important, especially if you're that one in the 30. So the question is, who amongst us with osteopenia, who is at highest risk of fracture? Who is likely to fracture? And this is what we're trying to sort out. When does osteopenia osteopenia indicate increased fracture risk. So I've been drawing up these little schemes, and maybe you'll play along with me here and get your little checklist out. If you have an osteopenia bone density and you are experiencing excessive bone loss, for example, if you're 5 years beyond menopause, well beyond that period when you rapidly lose bone, your bone loss should quiet down to 1/2 or 1% a year. But if you say, I'm losing 1%, more than 1%, I'm losing 2%, I'm losing more bone than I should, then it's very important to pay attention to that osteopenic bone density. So get out your little checklist. Like if you have osteopenia and you're experiencing excessive bone loss, now the only way you're going to know this is by your bone density test. Or your dentist may say to you, wow, you know, you've got an awful lot of receding gums, an awful lot of jawbone loss. Or you might get an x-ray for some reason, you hurt your foot, and they say, you know, this bone looks pretty thin. So if you're losing more bone than normal, and on betterbones.com we try to calculate and we report the studies that show the normal bone loss, but we know during menopause, that transition, women lose a lot of bone. The average woman loses 10% of her bone mass. I've seen many women lose 20% during those first few years before the last period to the first 5 years after. So that's always accelerated in most women. But after that, when you get to be your late 50s, 60s, you want that loss to slow down to 1/2 or at the max 1% a year. So if you're losing too much bone, you need to pay special attention to your type of osteopenia. If your body weight is low, we know you're going to have low bone density, right? Because the body weight is very linked to the bone, or we know it's very likely you will. But what's important here is the amount of muscle mass. If you're thin and have a lot of muscle mass, if you're small and a lot of muscle mass, your risk is very low. But if you're a lightweight person and you have little muscle mass, then you should check that box and say, I really should get serious about my bone strengthening, my bone strengthening program. If you have osteopenia and you are average weight or even above average weight, you want to think about it. That could be a risk factor because heavier people generally have better bone density. With every step, they put more impact on their bodies. The impact sends a signal to build new bone. So weight generally, as the weight goes up, the bone density goes up. But if you say, geez, I weigh 160 and they say I've got this, you know, I have osteopenia, then you want to pay special attention and you want to start to think, what could be the causes for this? And if you use certain medications, you definitely want to pay attention. When I say drugs here, I'm really talking about medications like steroid medications, like prednisone, and even now they've shown inhaled steroids that people use for asthma. Just today I saw Asthmacort advertised on the TV like a thing you should really take to get rid of your sinus. I mean, it's a really big shame because these steroids, even inhaled steroids, significantly damage bone and are really quite a direct route to much higher risk of fracture. There's many other medications that damage bone, like proton pump inhibitors. We'll have a list of all those for you, and we've written several blogs on those. So look at your medications, see if they damage bone. And if you have osteopenia and you're using these medications, then you're in that class where this osteopenia could be an important thing to pay attention to. And if you consume excessive alcohol, or if you tend to smoke, or have other lifestyle factors that are really depleting, like I've got some people I know that drink gallons of soda a day, well, that is directly going to cause a problem with bone. Any of these things, plus if you have another risk factor that's really known to weaken bone, like having MS or having Crohn's disease or a whole series of disorders where we don't use nutrients well and where the body is chronically inflamed, that's associated with osteoporosis. So if you have osteopenia and you've checked any of these boxes, and you say, yeah, this could be an important factor for me and I should pay special attention. The final one, of course, is if you have experienced a low trauma fracture. If you say, yeah, you know, I was walking my dog and he pulled on the leash and I fell down, I broke my wrist. Unless it's a very traumatic fall, you want to pay attention. That's a sign, that's a kind of a proof of the pudding sign that the bone is weak if you have a low trauma fracture. So the more boxes you checked off in our little quiz there, the more important it is that you develop a complete program to strengthen bone. And we call our program the Better Bones, Better Body program because the gist is you want to build all of your health. As I'm always saying, and I've taken to saying recently, the issue is trying to stay stronger longer. It's a question of whole body strength. It's really of very little avail in most cases, and certainly with osteopenia, to use a medication that may build bone density but cause other problems. Cause problems of cancer, heart disease, strokes, whatever. It doesn't make a lot of sense. You want to rebuild the total body strength, and you want to find the cause of the bone loss and the cause of the bone weakening. The Better Bones, Better Body program, as you see here, has several steps to it. You can do it on your own. You can take care to build your bone strength. And we'll be teaching these step by step in case you want to learn exactly how to do it and have us help you out with that. The seventh fact about osteopenia that your doctor didn't tell you, I have alluded to before. Fracture risk is determined by multiple risk factors. So don't get thrown off if you're told, hey, you have osteopenia, or even if you're told you have osteoporosis. Generally, the most important thing is the total load of risk factors. And so if you find that it's time to get concerned, look at those things you're doing, the lifestyle things, the medications, the way you eat, your nutritional supplements. This is the Better Bones, Better Body program, which really addresses first trying to understand what's actually happening in your case. Is there a real serious risk of fracture? And then looking at the multiple risk factors and working to correct those one by one. You might go back to the camel I presented a bit ago and just pick out one. It may be a factor of taking too much soda, or it may be a lack of sleep, or it may be a tendency to worry too much, which is very damaging to bone. You might have fun starting on our program just by looking at that camel and picking one or two lifestyle things you want to change or nutritional things you want to change. Fracture risk is determined by multiple risk factors. Remember that. One of the risk factors is age. And I always joke with my clients, you know, we're all going to decline. I actually joke, we're all going to dilapidate as we get older. But we don't have to dilapidate a lot. And the goal is to slow down the aging process. With age, at least in the United States, I'm not sure if this happens every place, and I hope to do a little study on this. But with age here, bone tends to get weaker. Bone doesn't repair itself so well. And a lot of our program is really to encourage the repair of bone, that we have all the nutrients, all the biochemical atmosphere we need to keep repairing bone. But as a whole, the average person, how they live their life, the aging itself tends to weaken bone. So if you have a bone density of -2 at 30, that's your risk of fracture is less than if you have -2 at 80. So at the same bone density, an older person has a greater risk of fracture than a younger person. And I always joke too, I say, hey, the more miles we put on the chassis, the more attention we want to pay. Had an interesting client the other day. She happened to see about our work, she happened to do our program without ever talking to me. She used the product I produce, and she went through menopause. She did great, she didn't lose any bone, she even gained a bit of bone, which is enormously unusual. Then she goes through menopause and she says, well, I think I'm okay, I think the worst is over. So she didn't pay attention to the program, and she lost a significant amount of bone, even though she was well beyond menopause. So now she's come back, getting back on board, and I bet we can help her to regain that bone density. But the peculiar thing is, sometimes we get confused and we think, well, I don't need to pay attention to my bone any longer. The obvious answer is just the opposite. The older we get, the more attention we want to pay to keeping our whole body, and particularly our skeleton, in a situation, nourishing it properly, setting the environment so it can continually repair itself. Age itself weakens bone. And the eighth point is that almost always bone drugs are ineffective and not necessary for those with osteopenia. I like to emphasize that if you go to the doctor and the doctor says, your situation's so severe, you should use bone drugs, then our response is always, well, doc, if it's that serious of a problem, we should try to find out the cause of the problem. And there's several medical tests that should be done, even if you were amongst those small number of people with osteopenia who are having a serious problem and an increased fracture risk, you still want to try to identify the cause of that problem. At the same time, you want to do everything possible you can with your lifestyle, with your nutrition, with your pH balance, to try to strengthen bone and strengthen the whole body. In the coming months, we'll prepare other courses for you on how to implement the Better Bones, Better Body program right in your own house. But just know that bone drugs are generally not effective for people with osteopenia. And if you're told you should take a bone drug, work with your doctor to explore the causes of bone weakness. We actually have a medical document on betterbones.com. On betterbones.com, we have a medical document called the Medical Osteoporosis Workup, which lists all these tests that are important to discover if there's any hidden causes or any medical issues behind the bone loss. So the Europeans said, you know, we think that there's disease mongering. That's what they called all this use of osteopenia as a medical condition. And so they looked at a large number of people. They looked at a great big study, and they said, if you look at people with an osteopenic bone density and you exclude the women who have already fractured, remember, because that really means there's a serious problem, who have experienced a low trauma fracture, and you exclude those who had one major risk factor like chronic steroid use or a disease that really directly causes osteoporosis. If you exclude these two high-risk groups, then what they found out is that you would have to treat 133 of these osteopenic women with harsh bone drugs for 3 years in order to prevent one single vertebral fracture. And vertebral fractures are much easier to prevent than hip fractures. It would be at a very high cost and a risk of multiple unwanted side effects. And these Spanish researchers actually called all this talk about osteopenia really disease mongering, that we have made up a disease and that the use of drugs for this made up disease is not at all appropriate or not at all effective. So you might say, what am I to do with all this? The first thing I would say, and this actually is what happened in my own personal case, being told you have osteopenia is best seen as a wake-up call. When I was in my late 30s, my grandmother fractured a hip at the age of 101. I don't know what she was doing in the bathtub at 101 all alone, but she slipped and broke a hip. And I always wondered, and she succumbed a year later from that hip fracture. She was a wonderful woman. We said, Grandma, do you want to go to the hospital? She said, no, I don't want to go to the hospital. I've taken care of my boys, her sons, for 100 years. They can take care of me. And she just went to rest, and she spent a year in bed and then passed on very peacefully. But I always wondered, how long would she have lived if she hadn't had that fracture? And when I was about 35, slightly after her death, I was told I had receding gums and some periodontal disease. Well, even though I was an active anthropologist then and really hadn't studied a lot about bone, I had studied enough to know that periodontal disease and receding gums were an early sign of bone loss. And sure enough, eventually I came to understand that I had osteopenia, and so I began really to dive deep into what's this all about and how can I strengthen my own bones. And it's actually become my passion over the last many years to understand, to really rethink bone health and to set a path by each of us can have that natural human potential, which that natural endowment we were given for lifelong bone health. Just like every animal in the forest, we should be able to maintain bones strong enough for everything we do, for all the daily activities we do. So if you have been told you have osteopenia, use it as a wake-up call. Use it as an opportunity to say, I should give some attention to myself. So many women I see are so busy taking care of everyone else that they do not take care of themselves. So take a few minutes, begin to think, what can I do to enhance my overall well-being and particularly my bone health? So as we conclude our discussion of those 9 important things your doctor didn't tell you about osteopenia, I want to thank you for joining us, and I want to emphasize that for lifelong strength and maximum total body health, everyone should and will benefit from investing their time and energy into building better bones and a better body. One of the major points of this discussion is that anybody can fracture. And let's not get mixed up by terms. Let's look at our total load of risk factors and work at reducing that total load so we might have better health, better vitality, and certainly better bone strength, that we may stay stronger longer. At the Center for Better Bones, we conduct many activities all aimed at helping each of you stay stronger longer. We have our Better Bones, Better Body program that you see the steps of here: nutrition steps, diet steps, supplement steps, steps of exercise, of course, stress reduction, many important aspects of your life that are going to make your bones stronger and allow you to have a total healthier condition. We are producing lots of products. We're going to have an Exercise Evolution, which is a weekly video series about different exercises that will enhance bone. We have, of course, our weekly blog that I put out, betterbones.com. We have hundreds of thousands of subscribers, and we'd like you to join us if you haven't joined. We have, of course, consultations with me, and we have even a fascinating online course that we're developing on how you can develop your own Better Bones, Better Body program right in your own home. There are also a myriad of exercise instructions. We love the weighted vest. We, of course, centralize our attention, and we pay a lot of attention on pH balance. We have a pH test kit. pH balance is very essential for bone health. And even a support kit for the people who want to get out there and start their own program by themselves. So if you found this video useful, if you have osteopenia and you want to take action, go to betterbones.com or give us a call, and we'd be very glad to help you develop your own personalized program to overcome osteopenia and to go from frightened to delighted and empowered. It's been my pleasure. I hope to be talking to you all soon, and I wish that you have the great fortune, all of you, to stay stronger longer.